to move into panel 2, which is making use of the advisor opinion on international and regional context. So I'd like to invite again one more time Zainab Wandati to moderate that session. Before that, maybe to ask the leads for the 2 breakout sessions. Breakout session 1, I believe Christine and Subramanian, and then breakout session 2, Satish Kumar and Joyce. I think Zainab will give you each maybe just 3 minutes, at most 5 maybe, to just give like key highlights in terms of what has come out of the breakout session, and then we'll move to the panel. So Zainab, over to you.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Are you okay? Okay. You know, afternoons are usually very difficult because you're tired, you're sleepy, and all the things in between. So just stand up. Stand up. We're just going to do something very simple. We're going to do something very simple. Just shake your body. However, whatever feels natural to you, shake your body. Feel the blood flowing through your system. Feel the blood flow. Even kick your legs. I see some people are not moving. Shake. Shake your body. Feel the blood flowing. Do whatever feels natural to you. Are you feeling better? Are you ready to continue? This is the last session, so I promise I'm going to try and make it as exciting as possible. Like here, you guys like my quick fires. So yes, the next panel, there will be a quick fire. But before we get started with that, just quick overview of what was discussed in the breakout sessions. The person leading breakout 1, Dr. Sevgan, I believe that was you. Was it Dr. Sevgan? Okay, you have three minutes to give us an overview of what it is you discussed in your team. And Dr. Satish, you can also prepare the person who will be making the presentation on your behalf. Okay. So that you go back to back. You can come here. Okay. You know or maybe you can do it from where you are.
From our group, it was a legal discussion, and I would prefer Christina to take the lead, and I can add in any point that is missing. Yeah. Okay. Because I'm basically a scientist, not legal.
That's okay.
Thank you.
Yes, that's fine. You have about 3 minutes.
Great. So we had a really robust conversation about what measures can be taken at the international level. We talked about the fact that as lawyers, we had a mix of lawyers, scientists, and political negotiators. But as lawyers, we have a tendency to think about what are the next steps in terms of litigation. And we talked about ways in which we can actually use the law and implement it in the more immediate term, because while onward litigation may be appropriate in some circumstances, the key is to do something now, given the urgency of the climate crisis, and any further on litigation would take years for an outcome. So we tried to focus on concrete implementation. The most immediate way is right now there are discussions taking place in the UN relating to the implementation of the advisory opinion in the form of a UN General Assembly resolution. That's been the practice following the issuance of advisory opinions. And so this is just following on that practice of implementation. But in contrast to other advisory opinion implementation processes, this has been a little bit more controversial, let's say, but part of that has been efforts to kind of go beyond the scope of what the court opined and to include issues like the establishment of a damages registrar and a more robust explanation of the legal consequences of sea level rise under international law. And so instead it was recommended, or the consensus view was that a more streamlined UN General Assembly resolution that basically just adopts what the court says would be more likely to be successful, because it is important, just as the General Assembly resolution referring the questions to the court was adopted by consensus, the opinion itself was unanimous, And so a third step of the implementation General Assembly resolution, it would be important that that also be adopted by consensus or at least a wide majority. So that that discussion took place. We also then moved on to the political negotiations in the upcoming COPs and the need to try to. We heard from Professor Rodriguez this morning about the UNFCCC in the negotiations and the desire of states to reference the advisory opinion, but that it did not ultimately make its way into the final work product. And so ways in which that might be achieved is by states citing to and discussing some of the points raised in the AO without necessarily saying that it's coming from the AO itself. In other words, sort of hiding the source of the position that they're taking as a way to for those principles to find their way in the political process. A good focus of our discussion was on financial and economic measures. So we talked about outright debt relief, restructuring of debt, reduction of interest rates, increased investments through development banks. And we talked about interesting different legal theories, invocation of Article 25 of the ILC articles on state responsibility, state of emergency, as different ways in which political negotiations can take place between developing states and industrialized states that are lenders under bilateral sovereign debt, loans within investment banks, as well as commercial loans, and what efforts can be used to make the cost of capital more available and at lower rates. And then we spoke about regional and contextual specific solutions with a science focus. And there was a really important intervention about the strong call for climate strategies that reflect regional realities rather than relying solely on external science from Europe, for example, which may not necessarily be appropriate in the African context, and the need to have Africa-driven climate strategies and scientific data. We then briefly touched on litigation pathways, although, as I mentioned, that wasn't really a focal point. Maybe if we had another half hour, we would have done that, but that there are possible onward state-to-state litigations that could be brought. We'd have to identify the right treaty for the jurisdiction, but that could be something in the future. Human rights-based claims at the regional human rights tribunal level and UN treaty enforcement bodies, as well as the interplay between the climate AO, climate obligations, and investor state dispute resolution, which will be a topic that will be discussed today and on the third day as well. So we concluded just that it's important to have a multi-pronged approach. There's no silver bullet. There's not one way to take this forward. We need to be looking at litigation, yes, but we need to be focusing on how can we most immediately implement the resolution through political, financial, and multilateral approaches. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. Dr. Satish?
Thank you, Zainab. My colleague, Dr. Joyce, will represent us. And also, there's a young rapporteur, ICRAF's capacity building initiative of having Kabrak University students. She also took notes. So I would suggest that after Dr. Joyce, if you give her 30 seconds, it will be the first time that she will exercise her. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll take 2 minutes max, so not a lot of time. But just to start, that we really had a very interesting session, and we felt that we thought that the time wasn't sufficient for the engagements because there were very rich discussions, a lot of questions, a lot of comments, a lot of reactions. And we really started to think very critically about the question that we posed to the group or in the session was, what would meaningful regional implementation of the ICJ opinion look like within African institutional frameworks, and what are the risks of purely symbolic adoption? So we thought that was a very critical question to ask, and to have the team react to that. And so we started by thinking about looking at these advisory opinion, how can it support domestic instruments, domestic legal instruments, domestic policies. So not just that, but really also the sort of the regional, how can it support regional cooperation in terms of Africa coming together to think about having a sort of more of an African-driven climate agenda. So really thinking about how can we work together as African states to think about our obligations, but also to think about how we relate with our environment, what are the human rights that are very pertinent to our continent, and also how we relate with foreign investment in terms of extraction of fossil fuels that continue to harm the planet and our continent in particular. And in that, we talked about very key issues to do with attribution, which is really trying to establish causal chains and evidence. We talked about what would these opinion mean for, say, issues like remaining carbon budget. And these we thought were very significant or key issues for an African sort of focused jurisprudence. And the other point was on uneven and escalating impacts in the African continent, thinking really about limits to adaptation, which touches very closely on loss and damage, thinking about adaptation finance, what does it mean for the African continent, issues of equity and inclusivity in climate action, which ties very closely to just an equitable transition, structural economic conditions, which I think the panel, the breakout session one also mentioned, is on international law in relation to debt repayments and debt cancellations, which are quite tied to human rights protections. And we didn't forget to think about investments in African science, and I think this is also a discussion that came in the breakout session one, investing in African science, African scientists, and African institutions so that we can have African-driven climate solutions that are actually speak to the African realities. We thought that is very important. The last point that I wanted to make was also on the roadmap to the African COP. What can we do between now and then to really have bringing all these issues that I've talked about to present it, to make sure that we're well prepared at the African COP, to articulate these issues and to inch them in sort of the negotiations that we're gonna have. But it's really thinking about like how do we have Africa at the center of the discussion and being at the table and participating meaningfully. And the last one is on sensitization of the African states, which was a very important point that came from the floor, is only 2 African states have made submissions to the African Court of Peoples and Human Rights, and we think that we need sort of a sensitization process or initiative to make sure that we have more states make submissions to the court. The court has been asked to provide an extension for states to make submissions, and we hope that the court will respond positively to that, and there will be room for states to make submissions. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you still want your rapporteur to say something, or just to say hi to everyone? Hi.
Hello, my name is Salome Chepto, and I come from Kabarak University. I came with the Kabarak University press team, and from this, I was rapporteuring the session, and from the session, maybe just to highlight what we discussed and to give 5-pointer outcomes that we made from the discussion. So the discussion began with the special circumstances that are unique to African states. And the first one was the biophysical exposure, and then the fiscal vulnerability, poverty, and less access to clean energy. And the second thing we discussed in our breakout session was why we as African states opt to go to court. And so I'm going to just list 3 of them. The first one was the failure in multilateralism, and the second one was mounting severity of the climate crisis, and the last one that I'm going to mention is the inadequacy of private and public responses. The other thing that we discussed was the causation. Dr. Joyce mentioned that it is so important to link the emissions, for example, the emissions to the impacts it has on climate change. We talked about the chain of causality. And the other thing that we talked about was the areas significant for African focused jurisprudence. And one of them was foreseeability, attribution, that is the causal chain, and remaining carbon budget. There was also a discussion on adaptation gap report. And this adaptation gap report shows that there is under financing and there's also under preparedness. The other thing that we discussed from our breakout session was the remaining carbon budget. So under the remaining carbon budget, we stated that there is need for us as African states to think of transitions. So I think that's the brief summary of what we talked about. And from the outcomes, we had 5-pointer outcomes. And the first one was the capacity building and development, which can be achieved through mobilization and working groups. The second one was mainstreaming or integrating the ICJ's advisory opinion by coming up with policies using the decision made by the advisory opinion made by the ICJ. The other thing that we talked, the other outcome was embodying on or incorporating regional, international, environmental law for African regions. The other thing that was part of our outcome was the embodying nationally determined contributions. And at this point, we noted that this could take some time because it needs a lot of resources. And then the final one was on sensitization. This can be achieved through education. And as Dr. Joyce had pointed out, we talked about the fact that for the case that is pending before the African Court on Human and People's Rights, the advisory opinion matter, we noted that only 2 states have made submissions, and we are aiming to get at least 50% of the African states to make submissions. So there's need to sensitize the African states to make the submissions. That's what I got from the breakout session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope your opinions have been adequately represented, voiced by the people who represented you. You're satisfied, right? Great. So moving on. That Africa contributes 4% the global emission is something we hear a lot. Africa contributes 4% to greenhouse gases, but suffers some of the worst impacts of climate change. That's a cliche. You hear that all the time. And for some reason, that number never seems to change. Is it still 4%? Because the emissions keep rising, but Africa's number, is it getting lower or higher? It's getting lower. Micheka there says it's lower. What's the number right now?
You know, let me tell you this, that I would like to go back to science and technology and really dig into the numbers, the statistics that formed the current 3.7. Then I used the same methodology to find out whether it went lower or up. But in my present standing, it actually is going lower.
So it's less than 4% now?
Yeah, less than 3.7%.
Less than 3.7%.
It was, she rounded up to 4. Yeah. Let's put this actual statistics is 3.7 and it's going lower. Yep.
Okay, so that is quite a small number compared to what other countries are emitting. But the impacts that the continent suffers, is there anyone in this room who can say you have not experienced the impacts of climate change? Anyone who can actually say, I have never seen the impacts of climate change in my life? Is there anyone? So we've all lived it. All of us, you know someone who has either lost a home, lost this, lost that, suffered this, suffered that. So we are not having this conversation in a vacuum. So this ICJ advisory already has brought it all home to us. And following the opinion, the issuance of the opinion, is that the right thing to say? Is that a right word? Issuance of an opinion. Following the advisory, the African Union in November 2025 last year outlined a strategy, and one of them was to push for a resolution at UNGA to operationalize this opinion, particularly matters climate finance, to reframe climate finance as a legal entitlement, and also to strengthen the domestic legislation capacity ahead of any anticipation litigation. So the panel we're going to have sits at the intersection of all of this. The panelists represent the legal architecture, the scientific evidence base, and of course the frontline negotiators who represent us in those negotiating rooms and now are armed with this opinion as they walk into those rooms. So I'd like to introduce them, and as I call your name, please come up to the stage. Ms. Christina Huras is a partner at Foley Hogg LLP, Global Co-Chair of the International Litigation and Arbitration Department. She chairs the United Nations Practice Group and has represented small island states. Some of the nations suffer some of the worst impacts of climate change, and also developing nations at the ICJ. And she's simply one of the most experienced climate litigation lawyers in the world. Is that the nicest thing someone has said about you today? Is that the nicest thing someone has said about you today? Oh, good. I can say it again. One of the most experienced climate litigation lawyers in the world. Next, Ambassador Dr. Namira Negm. She's the director of African Migration Observatory and the former legal counsel of the African Union Commission, the first woman to ever hold that role, by the way. And she also represented Ghana. Earlier on this afternoon, I heard you say you're from Egypt, but you represented Ghana. You're legal counsel for Ghana. Yes. I have such bright legal minds here. Yeah, so at the ICJ, that is, so she's represented Africa at the ICJ and the ICC on landmark cases. And she's currently driving an agenda around data justice and climate-induced displacement, things like that. Great. Dr. Zenli, Dr. Lee, karibu sana. Dr. Lee is an associate legal officer at the International Court of Justice Registry. She brings us some valuable experiences, such as an institutional view from inside the court that produced this ruling. Yeah. And so we expect that maybe she'll tell us with precision what the opinion actually says. And there's what you think it says, and then there's what it actually says. What you think it means and what it actually means. So she'll probably break that down for us. Dr. Omukoya, Dr. George Omukoya, karibu sana. Dr. Omukoya leads the African Group of Negotiators Expert Support at AGNES. And he comes to this conference, by the way. Last week was at another pre-SB64 meeting to prepare the African negotiators for the talks in Bonn. And this meeting was held here in Nairobi, a strategy session here in Nairobi. And there he was sharpening Africa's position ahead of the meeting in Bonn. So he lives and breathes climate negotiations. So if there's anyone who will tell us the practicality of this opinion in those negotiation rooms, it's him. And then last but not least, Dr. Abdu Tenkwano, is he still in the room? No, okay. Great. So before we start, Christina, I believe you have 10 minutes to make a setting the scene. Mm-hmm.
We have the slides. Great, thank you. So I'm going to present today on making use of the advisory opinion in a practical way. So building off of the comments that I made just now, introducing our discussion during the breakouts. And there are going to be some overlaps of what I discussed today with a panel that is taking place on the third day. And so it's just an ongoing discussion important for us to have on how states can use the advisory opinion to defend against claims raised by investors under multilateral and bilateral investment treaties I'll then talk about how states can make use of the advisory opinion to prevent disputes through effectively an audit of their investment treaties and different measures that they can take with regards to existing treaty frameworks. And then finally, I will talk about debt structuring. So with respect to defending against investor state claims, this issue has arisen because a number of states that have taken measures to address the climate crisis by, for example, complying with their Paris Agreement obligations and seeking to phase out coal-fired power or to more effectively regulate the fossil fuel industry or to adopt subsidies to promote clean tech. Those states, in many instances, have faced multi-million and even billion-dollar claims by foreign investors, arguing that the measures taken by the government constituted unlawful expropriation, unlawful taking, or unfair and inequitable treatment, or breaches of other provisions of multilateral investment treaties. And so the result is that states have effectively been placed between a rock and a hard place. If they comply with their climate obligations, then they may face the financial consequences of having to defend against investment treaty claims before arbitral tribunals. And so I have a sampling of cases before you. The Rockhopper case has recently been annulled, but albeit on grounds that are not necessarily relating to the findings. And so these are a sampling of cases showing that states from Italy, Canada, and Senegal to Netherlands have all faced such claims. So with this context, actually together with Judge Okowa and other members of our legal team before the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, in both our written and oral submissions, we raised this tension, effectively the regulatory chill, that states are not taking perhaps the measures that they should out of fear that they'll be sued before investment tribunals. And so we raised it in our written submissions, and at the oral phase, we actually had Sierra Leone itself had a dedicated section that was just covering this issue, which I argued on behalf of Sierra Leone. And although the Law of the Sea Tribunal didn't have an explicit reference to the regulatory chill effect or investment treaties, there is a finding that states have the right to regulate the fossil fuel industry, the conduct of both public and private actors. And so building on that finding of the ITLOS body tribunal, we then, in the context of the ICJ advisory opinion, elaborated on the point and did so in our submissions for the Gambia, for Namibia, for Malawi, I'm blanking, Sierra Leone and Kenya, as well as other states came in, Cote d'Ivoire, Mexico, and Albania. And so there was a more robust discussion of this tension between ISDS and climate obligations. And the result is that we have something useful in the advisory opinions to take forward in defending against such claims. We've talked about this already, so I won't spend too much time, but there was a rejection of the lex specialis argument, and thus there's no actual inconsistency between the climate change treaties and other rules of international law, and arguably that means that investment law is also consistent with that. The due diligence obligation to prevent, reduce, and control activities contributing to anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions includes regulating the private actors, a failure to take appropriate action, including through fossil fuel production and consumption, granting exploration licenses or subsidies to the fossil fuel industry may constitute an internationally wrongful act that would be attributable to the state. And then finally, the finding that their obligations ergo omnes. All of these points feed into how investment treaties must be interpreted. And so we have to read existing treaties, even those so-called Dutch gold standard treaties. We have to read them in accordance with climate obligations. And most investment treaties have explicit mandates for interpretation, requiring that the treaty be interpreted in accordance with applicable rules and principles of international law. So using that as a hook in investment treaties, that can be an avenue to bring in the findings of the advisory opinion and the climate obligations. Judge Sarah Cleveland, in her separate opinion, went further, and there's a more explicit discussion of that interplay. And she talked about the regulatory chill and the interpretation of investment instruments must be informed by states' obligations in respect of climate change under international law, including stringent due diligence standards to which states are bound in implementing in such obligations. So that's a useful separate opinion that can be cited by states in defending against such claims. And that feeds into the police power doctrine, or the margin of appreciation enjoyed by states to regulate in the public interest. So if a state has taken a non-discriminatory measure that is for the public purpose, including with respect to climate change, that should not give rise to unlawful conduct under the applicable treaties. And we've seen that be successfully invoked in the context of health measures in the Philip Morris versus Uruguay case, which our firm was happy to handle on behalf of Uruguay. And then more recently in the environmental context in the Eco Oro versus Colombia decision of, I believe it's 2021. So this shows that there are definite avenues where states can use the advisory opinion to defend against investment treaty claims. But there are steps that states can take to aim to prevent such claims from being filed in the first place. And that is through many means, but including through a more careful evaluation of existing treaties. So what states can do is go through and conduct an audit of all of their bilateral and multilateral investment treaties and assess whether some of the older treaties, the prior generation treaties, might benefit from clarifying language, for example, through the issuance of joint interpretive statements. If they have a treaty partner that is willing to agree to the issuance of a joint interpretive statement that expresses explicitly the right to regulate, including in the context of environment and climate measures and specific carve-outs, environmental and human rights carve-outs, that could be a way of further clarifying under the already existing treaties that the climate obligations take precedent over any treaty obligations, or that there's not any inconsistency as between them. So that's what can be done with respect to treaties that have already been concluded. If you have a treaty partner that is unwilling or doesn't agree on that interpretive statement, an option could be to file a state-to-state investment arbitration on the question of interpretation. So if it's a treaty between industrialized state and a developing state, and the industrialized state doesn't agree to your interpretation of the treaty, you could arguably file a state-to-state case against the other state, arguing that your interpretation is correct and citing to the advisory opinion among other sources as the basis for that. Then you have the outcome, hopefully a positive one, in the context of the state-to-state arbitration with respect to that treaty. Then in any future investor state claims brought under that treaty, you could argue that there's already a binding finding by an arbitral tribunal interpreting that provision. And so that is the interpretation that must be followed in subsequent investor state arbitrations. So that's option 2. And option 3 is then with respect to negotiating new investment treaties. And there, we call them next generation BITs. There could be these explicit references that we're talking about worked into those template bits that are used to negotiate with states. And states really should insist on the inclusion of those provisions in those negotiations. In addition to the explicit reference to the right to regulate, terms that could be included also are counterclaims, explicit reference that the state can file counterclaims against the investor for breach of environmental laws and human rights and other such obligations. And then finally, coming up with regional practice, consistent practice in the African continent, including coming up with science-based and procedurally fair energy transition frameworks that would not give rise to arguments that there was some sort of discriminatory measures in adopting those regulations. So now I'll briefly turn to making use of the advisory opinion for debt structuring. We had some robust discussions about this already, but it really is an important aspect of implementation because it is sort of the practical next steps, and it's something that's very much needed. So the problem is that vulnerable states find themselves in what is called a climate debt trap. So the cost of borrowing for vulnerable states, and it turns out to be high because there's high political risk associated with investing in those states. And that could be due to a number of factors, not exclusively due to climate change, but climate change is a big factor, and not having the appropriate infrastructure in place, like, for example, seawalls and other adaptation measures, could result in ratings agencies like Moody's and others assigning a higher country risk and thus a higher corresponding interest rate for any projects in that state. And so that increases in turn the cost of borrowing and sort of ties the hands of states that want to invest either in repairing the harm caused by climate change to their state, or in taking certain preventative measures, adaptation measures, so that to avoid future harm. And those higher interest rates make the projects not only unaffordable, but they might deter the right quality of entities that are interested in investing and taking on such projects. And so this resulting diversion of funds and underinvestment, because the money is being used to service debt as opposed to projects, just puts vulnerable states in this cyclical climate debt trap. And so there should be ways to explore how to get out of that. So there's the duty to cooperate through climate finance, and we've talked about that at length. That's found in the Paris Agreement and UNFCCC, and I won't go into that in the interest of time. But those obligations ultimately find their way in the advisory opinion and can be used by states in their political negotiations. If states have to use reasonable good faith measures to enable effective climate action, if possible remedies include cessation, guarantees of non-repetition, and full reparation, couldn't that possibly include debt relief? Couldn't that be an argument that is raised on a country-to-country level? And financial assistance has to be understood as part of an implementation strategy. And so these are all points to be raised in discussions with lenders, including sovereign debt. So there are various options for addressing debt, and we went over some of these in our breakout session, but one is outright debt forgiveness and grant financing. Debt forgiveness being, if it's a sovereign debt, that state just outright forgiving the debt. In the case of grant financing, it's a state effectively paying off the loan for another state. Those are great aspirational avenues, but at least from my study, they've not been actually implemented anywhere to date, but it's something definitely to aspire to. There are debt for climate swaps and sustainability-linked bonds. Those are contingent avenues. So in other words, the loan is provided, or the funds are provided in exchange for a state making a certain commitment, like either that the funds are only going to be used for clean tech, or the funds are going to be used for reforestation. And so those could be helpful in circumstances where a state actually wants to undertake those types of projects. But there has been some controversy associated with them because they've been viewed as a kind of form of recolonization, where the developing world is sort of forcing states that are trying to develop to invest in certain ways that might not be best for development. Maybe funds do need to be used for road construction and other projects, and maybe clean tech investments are not necessarily the priority for a given state. So there has been some controversy associated with them, and they also don't get at the issue of interest rates for other necessary projects. There's also climate resilient debt clauses, and those are really wonderful in the sense that if there is some sort of big catastrophe or irregular weather pattern, that the interest rate is frozen for a period of time while the state recuperates from that incident. So those are quite helpful. And then there's also concessional lending. So the extension of the term of the loan. So you're paying the debt over a longer period of time, but the interest rate is less. And so in the end, you're paying quite a bit of interest, but at least on a year-to-year basis, the interest rate is lower as a result. So these are sort of the existing frameworks that we have for debt structuring that can be considered. And it's, of course, a case-by-case context and what makes sense for a given state in the moment and what its counterparty is willing to engage with. So I have a novel approach, I think. I don't think it's been written about or tried, and I had some discussions with some experts here, and I think that it is a new theory, but I have to do some more reading and see if that's the case. But my idea is basically to have interest rate buy downs where a state, a developed state, contributes certain funds up front, be it to a commercial lender or it could be to a development bank on behalf of the developed state as a way to buy down the interest rate. So instead of, for example, getting a loan at 15%, the developed state pays some upfront fees on behalf of the developed state, and the interest rate is reduced to 5%. So you could think about it in the context of home loans. If you're buying a house and you're getting a 30-year loan, you can pay points up front to the bank in exchange for a 1% reduction in your home loan, for example. So this could be done in the context of another state buying or development bank buying down the loan of a developing state. And so that's basically a form of subsidizing the cost of borrowing. And so if that were to be implemented, that would mean that developed states would be able to take out loans more effectively and implement that into development projects, including adaptation measures. With better adaptation infrastructure, then that would potentially reduce country risk, because if the state has the appropriate infrastructure in place to adapt to the effects of climate change, then maybe there is a reduction in political risk associated with investing in that country. So that would then bring down the country risk and the interest rate in turn through that development. And so that's a way to sort of get out of the climate debt trap, break out of it, and start to make progress in terms of development and addressing debt issues. And so that frees up other financial resources that the state can use for other purposes. So that's just an idea that I'm hoping to develop, and I would be curious to get folks' thoughts on that as we continue the discussion. So I'll stop there, and I've gone a little bit over my time, but I thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Christina. You can take questions at the end of the panel.
Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, because we are running so far behind time, I would like to move this panel as quickly as possible, so we see how much you can catch up, so you don't keep here later than is necessary. So as usual, I'd like to start by setting the scene. She's already set the scene, but I'd like to create a scenario that you can work around. Global superpowers today deploying icebreakers to the Arctic, not to study, not to save, but to make a route, a shipping route, the Northern Sea route that would shave off weeks of shipping, particularly between Asia and Europe, a route or an activity that is being made possible by the melting ice in the Arctic. So an environmental problem creating an opportunity for commercial success, something like that. While on the flip side, some of the look at the world's arid lands, some of the driest parts of the world, communities that live there herding their cattle for generation after generation, living on livestock. But then the drier those lands get, the less pasture they have for these animals. Sometimes they don't even have any food, like we've seen in the Horn of Africa, drought decimating millions and millions of heads of livestock. So again, in the Horn of Africa, by 2022, the Horn of Africa had experienced at least 4 consecutive failed rain seasons, which as a result pushed 23 million people on the edge of famine. 23 million, can you imagine? That's a lot of people because of an environmental crisis. So you see an environmental problem creating a strategic wealth generation opportunity in the global north, while at the same time an existential crisis in the global south, an environmental problem. So now we have one of the world's highest courts saying this is not just a political problem, it's also a legal one. So we'll start with the basic question. Does the ICJ advisory opinion actually have the legal teeth to reconcile that asymmetry? We could start with, with you, who actually represented a country at the ICJ.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here I have to make this disclaimer. I'm here in my personal capacity. I have nothing to do with all the titles I carry. When it comes to the advisory opinion, we have few things that we can benefit of when we are talking about the South and specifically Africa. Yeah. And what you mentioned is in relation to adaptation, basically. What like the crisis creates opportunity. This doesn't happen in every incident, and this is something we have to bear in mind, that when we speak about the reality, in some aspects it presents an opportunity, in others it's a real crisis, and for us in Africa is mostly crisis. And let me be clear why it's mostly crisis, and this is beyond the law, that simply, even like if we speak about the mobility, and this is one thing I'm working on, the climate mobility, which is on the rise on the continent because of the sea level rise, because of the floods, droughts, name it. Yes, it's a form of adaptation, but we are not having the infrastructure in the continent to be able to adapt to this mobility so quickly. Because it's not only of the crisis happening and trying to find the remedy for, but also because sometimes it happens all of a sudden. And it's very difficult to anticipate. And that is why you find now like the urbanization of the cities in Africa, unhealthy, as well as affecting our food security. So this is something that we have to bear in mind. When it comes to the advisory opinion, yes, it mentioned the adaptation. It mentioned it as part and parcel of the issue. If we go beyond the advisory opinion or the build up to the advisory opinion, in the COPs, we managed to speak about the human face of the climate change, which is not only the mobility, but the loss of lives. And of course, not only the human lives, but others. And I will just give a quick example from where I come now, from Morocco. This year, after long years of drought, Morocco faced floods, and you cannot imagine the amount of cattle that died. I'm not speaking only about the agriculture or the human beings that had to move. Like internal displacement became so high. So the climate mobility is adding a problem here, and eventually it will be affected and affecting the law internally, because people who are moving from a city to another, they need to be registered, they need to have healthcare, they need civil registration, and we are already far behind in this. So this needs to be like rectified. So who carries the burden? And here we go back to the state responsibility. And here it's the national responsibility towards the nationals moving internally, like the internal displacement, but the causality is international. So we go back to the rules of the state responsibility coming from the advisory opinion. One factor which is crucial, because whenever we speak about advisory opinions, especially those who do not like the advisory opinion, they come and say it's non-obligatory, it's and so on. And my argument is the advisory opinion, the obligations therein become mandatory, not because of the advisory opinion, because of the treaties, because of the customary international law embedded in the advisory opinion, which are already mandatory on the states. Here, the advisory opinion is only declaratory of erga omnes obligations, and that is why the lex specialis argument was refuted. And here we have to connect these elements together. like the erga omnes obligations, to the impacts on the ground, be it opportunities versus crisis. And I'll stop here.
Okay, so Christina, you work with the states that literally are going underwater, the small island states, constantly living in fear of being drowned from their homes. So before the ICJ advisory, when these small island states sat across the table from the major emitters and looked them in the eye, and year after year hearing the non-commitment that they want to see, or the non-commitment that they want to have, or even the the responsibility that they want them to at least take responsibility that I'm suffering this problem because of something you did, and therefore you need to compensate me for it. So we have this advisory opinion now. What argument can they make when they sit at the next table and you're sitting in front of an emitter? What argument can they make now that they could not have made before?
A comprehensive legal framework. So before it was sort of different bodies of law and it wasn't really clear how they interact. And so instead of having that that sort of ambiguity, now we have this beautiful quilt. All of the pieces have been sewn together, and so the positions can be made a little bit more clear in those negotiations. And also the obligations, the consequences of non-compliance, and using those options in their negotiations, and some of the points that I raised in my presentation today. And also for vulnerable small island states, there is the issue of the legal consequences of sea level rise. And so there is some clarification in that regard as well, in terms of whether there's a mirroring effect of the Montevideo Convention. And if you lose one element of the Montevideo Convention, does that mean that you no longer, that you cease to exist as a state? And so we don't have an absolute answer, but we have an answer that most likely not. So that's something that definitely they can use in their ongoing discussions on that issue.
Okay. At this point, I'd like to bring in Dr. Omukoya. You're a negotiator. You've sat in those rooms. You've seen how Africa struggles. And a lot of times, the civil society groups will describe it as hopeless, a hopeless scope for Africa. We have no hope of getting anything out of this. You've been in those rooms, burning the midnight oil and whatnot. You've seen the dominant framings about rights and legal obligations that Africa has been making. And so now that you have this advisory opinion, how do you see this fundamentally changing?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think the point here is that if you look at the legal framework that we established in 1992, which resulted into the UNFCCC, CBD, and the certification, and then subsequent Kyoto Protocol, and which Lucy talked about, and finally the Paris Agreement, you can see that there has been dilution on the historical responsibility, particularly to those countries that caused the harm, trying to run away from that responsibility. And that can be seen from the Paris Agreement. And that's why Louisiana made reference to Article 9.1 and Article 9.2. You can see that the language in the convention talked about Annex 1, Annex 2 countries providing a means of implementation, which is capacity building, finance, and technology development and transfer. But now in Paris, we added that developed countries take the lead. That already changes the language. And then we added other countries can also contribute. And that means, therefore, you are diluting that historical responsibility and putting almost all the countries at the same level. But I think also and the reality in negotiation is that we must appreciate that the world has changed. We're not in 1992. The leading emitter now is China.
Who is a member of the G77?
Who is a member of G77, which I happen to lead. So it's a very difficult. And when we're sitting as Africa, you have South Africa, which is a big a contributor to the emissions. And it's on that basis that you find within the G77, we have smaller groups coming up. That's why in 2015, when we were negotiating the Paris Agreement, a group came up first, BASIC, that one because they realized they needed to speak together. But then we get another group called like-minded developing countries. So those are countries who felt that they are not comfortable in the bigger G77. They need their message in this particular. So how do we see this? One is, I think it reinforces the point that historical responsibility is still valid. And number two, it completely erases this notion that you can pull out of the convention, you can pull out of Paris Agreement, you don't sign and ratify the Kyoto Protocol, and therefore you are not obligated to do anything. It simply says, no, you are still held best by the international customary law and the treaty law, and therefore, as much as US claims it's moving out, but the reality is it is still liable and it ought to meet those obligations. The third issue area I see is that the advisor gives us now an opportunity to think in the future. And as you know, we have these national determined contributions where countries indicate their commitments or what they want to do now up to 2050, for example. But also we have a cycle of 5 years in the global stocktake, which then enables us to assess the progress we're making to meet the 1.5 degree that was referenced. And by so doing, therefore, the advisor can help us to relook at how do we use the instrument there to help us recast how we want to see the global stock taking shape and giving guidance to the subsequent. And then finally is we have other streams that have been made reference to here. The just transition. Just transition is another very important area because if you look at Article 4, paragraph 1E of the convention, it talks about adaptation, and Africa is specifically mentioned. And so how do we take advantage of that in line with what has been espoused in the advisory to put a strong argument to advance what we would like to see. And in that respect, therefore, I'm looking at 3 things. One, in 2030, countries will be developing their NDCs. How do we integrate principles or what has been espoused here into the NDCs and NAPs? NAP review will be 2028. Number 2 is that countries are right now developing national adaptation plans. Unfortunately, Africa, less than half of them have submitted their national adaptation plans, and yet we claim adaptation is a priority. So that means we're not living to that expectation. And the third, which I think is important, and I'll end with this, is that the conversation is no longer north-south. If you look at the carbon trading now, we have south-south trading. Singapore has signed an agreement in Kenya and many other countries. So you can no longer be referring to north. You need to now look at how do we relate south-south and how does this apply? Because it may not apply in the context that we have traditionally said north-south. Thank you.
So therefore, from Bonn, we should expect to see a difference in Africa's strategy in the negotiations?
Yes and no. yes, to the extent that there are very good elements in that. And that's why we have developed a decision support tool, which will put the need there so that you can make some comment to enable negotiators to be able to extract, type in whatever question they want and they'll be able to extract key messages to help them. And know from the group that was, I think it was group 2, awareness. How many outside this room know about the advisory? Very few. Even within the negotiation group, very few. And so until we sensitize them on that, unfortunately, we can't. And here you have to target 2. Technical, we can deal with it. It's easier. How do we get the ministerial, which is the AMSEN, the African Ministers of Environment? The current chair is Libya. How do we get the next AMSEN to make reference to that? Because once it makes reference to that, then it means that as negotiators, we are supposed to be guided by the ministers. Then how do we get the ministers' key messages to feed in the Committee of Heads of State government on climate change, which is chaired by Kenya? Because the heads of state, again, we need some statement from there which sends a signal to everyone that, look here, Africa is considering this. So we may need to find a way as to how we interact with these 3 levels so that that awareness is there and we generate. And I think I had some summaries or whatever we can prepare, which then can inform these different levels so that those messages can be used to inform the negotiations, but also to inform the domestic reforms that can support the action in relation to climate change. Thank you.
So the long and short of it is that the road is still long for Africa.
Yes.
Okay, Dr. Lee, for people in this room who are not international lawyers, what is the difference between an advisory opinion and a binding agreement? And why does this distinction matter when we talk about what happens next, the next steps?
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Advisory opinion is a request from General Assembly or Security Council.
Could you raise your voice a bit?
Sure. Advisory opinion is triggered by requests from the General Assembly or Security Council or specialized agencies authorized by the General Assembly. The advisory opinion is not binding. There's no parties to advisory opinion, but only participants. However, it is a legal advice to the relevant organ or agency that asks for it. So it is a legal advice for the General Assembly. Although it is not binding, but in the history, advisory opinions have made a substantive contribution to international law, especially in 2 aspects. The first is about the development of international institutional law, which there is very little legal instruments or even none. Even the international personality of United Nations itself was judicially created or pronounced by the International Court of Justice back in 1949. Only since then, United Nations become on the equal footing as the other member states of the United Nations or the members of the international community. And in 1980, also for the first time, the ICJ through advisory opinion pronounced the legal personality of general international organizations. That is very critical decision-making because only since then did the international society really legally expanded, not to only include sovereign states, but also international organizations. So that's one perspective that the court through advisory opinions, even though not binding, still contribute a lot to international decision-making. And the second perspective is self-determination. It's also a perspective of law that is substantially contributed by the advisory opinions of the court through early decisions, to recent decisions on Chagos and also Palestine advisory opinions. So even if it's not binding, it can be even more legally and politically important as those binding judgments of the court. So binding judgments are contentious cases. Parties come to the court based on compromissory clause or declaration accepting compulsory jurisdiction of the court. And then the judgments are only binding on the parties to the contentious cases, not on other parties. So those are the binding judgments. That's the difference between the two.
Will the success of this opinion, or maybe the enforceability of the opinion, be dependent on the political goodwill?
Sorry, on the political goodwill.
Yeah.
The success, I think I want to emphasize one thing. I think the date the hearing was accomplished, everything I say is personal idea. I'm sorry for the late of the disclaimer. Nothing, in no event can I represent the court or judges I serve, Judge Yusuf or Judge Okoba. So everything I say here is personal idea. I think the moment the hearing was accomplished was already a big thing, because this is the first case in the 80 years of history of the court that more than 100 participants came to our proceedings and participated in the written pleadings. And if we think in the perspective of international public decision making or participation in the public decision making, all the states, 30 minutes, equal treatment, big or small powers, they plead before the court. To me, that's already a big thing. And they raise their equal voice. We can see some small island states shouting at the United Kingdom. That was one of my favorite moments when watching it. So I think that kind of public decision-making participation is already a big thing. So to me, even that part is already successful. Whether or not we have subsequent implementation at different levels.
Okay, Christina, George talked about South Africa being part of the African group, and yet we know South Africa is growing, is becoming a growing emitter, and it's not the only one in Africa. There's also Nigeria growing emitter, Egypt a growing emitter, which you might say presents a problem for George and his team when they are negotiating. From where you sit as somebody who's actually represented countries that are seeing this impacts of climate change, does this expose their growing emission status? Does it expose them to future liability, one? And two, how would you recommend negotiators like George to navigate this dicey moment? You can't kick them out of the bloc. You can't kick them out of the African group. They're still part of you, but they are growing emitters. How would they balance that? You can take a... You've handed over the question. Okay.
Okay. I'll speak about it from first the perspective of the developing countries, especially from Africa. And when we speak about, as you mentioned, the rising emitters, George would know South Africa is not like, it's been for a while since I was in the UN, so it has been there, but it was building up. But one of the things that, as I'm the honorary president of the African Society for International Law, and I advise you to look into the proceedings of the Society of 2024, it was in Lagos. And we addressed the development issue because of the fossil fuels. And this is something, and I think I like the idea that finally the developing countries will take the lead in the negotiations. Why? Because of the narrative. You even mentioned in your remarks when you opened the planes, okay? So if we're talking about different industries, and people with scientific background would know better than I, the emissions coming from such developed industries, and probably we do contribute to it, but minute, because our airlines are minute in comparison to the other parts of the world. The same with the vessels, the same, and I'm speaking even only about civilian aspects. I'm not speaking about the wars they are waging and the emissions that comes out of it. But they come and focus only on fossil fuels. Why? Who produces the fossil fuels? Who will benefit out of the fossil fuels? The movement from natural gas to the electricity as clean. When we found natural gas, we said, oh, now we have much cleaner fuel source that we can work with, and it will save us a lot of emissions versus oil and coal. All of a sudden, from the natural gas, we're jumping to electricity and powered like batteries, right? Why? Because the natural gas is here and they want to ban us from exploiting it because it will never be 100% clean. And that's why we will add to the emissions as well. But where are we in the schedule of emissions versus the others? And this is where we should do the awareness. We should do the change. And this will have legal implications. Yes, the emitters, and this is why I'm saying when we speak about the advisory opinion, when we speak about state responsibility, and we speak about the rise of, and this was, by the way, the main argument of China. You have had how many years to emit, to develop? And once you reach that level, you want us to abide by your level while we are still developing. It doesn't work this way. And this is something we have to look into from our side, to look at our benefits. How, yes, to make it cleaner, it's true, but at the same time, it should not hamper development. You mentioned before the crisis becoming an opportunity. Look how many opportunities came to Africa versus how many opportunities came to the West. This is the whole thing. They are better in planning, they are better in science, they are like going straight, controlling everything. And that is the good thing out of the advisory opinion, saying that science and technology should not be banned from the rest of us. It's a right, okay? But in reality, how far are we able to impose that on the Western Hemisphere when every single thing is patented, even with medicine? So this is something we have to look into, and that is why when I speak about South-South cooperation, I do agree with George, it's not like before. But here where like-minded can work. Like-minded not only politically or legally, but also when it comes to the development. Where are we on the level of development? We have to exchange together and move to the least developed and give them what we reached. We do have scientists, we do have engineers, we do have IT specialists who are very well trained. Let them have the opportunity to do something. So it has to do with changing the narrative within Africa. And as you said, you cannot kick those countries out of the African group, but you can see how you can, again, mitigate the language of the climate change COP, how to mitigate within the group to find common grounds to move together. Because honestly, it's only the power of the numbers, he knows as well. Thank you.
Okay, so George, to pick up from there, she mentioned how the West is better prepared. And this is a criticism that the African group gets a lot, that one, you're short-handed in terms of negotiators, you're short-handed in terms of lawyers to waste each other's time and things like that, which the West does really good with. So in light of the incapacities that Africa faces, the challenges that Africa faces, how long would you say to take for Africa to fully take advantage of this advisory opinion?
Yeah, I think there are some fast runners in Africa. So I don't think we can say that in a blanket that Africa cannot move. They are from the landscape in this space. They are front runners. We had here Kenya is one. Rwanda is another, Egypt, Morocco, if you're looking at renewable energies. South Africa has a very elaborate legislative framework. And then we have a challenge in Central Africa. And that's something that we realize cascades across that development perspective. So there will be those who are front runners. What are we doing? One is that besides negotiation, we have realized that until the negotiators come back and work within their countries and regions to start translating some of what they have negotiated into implementable investment activities, we are going to have NDCs, NAPs as a pipe dream. And one of the programs that we are involved in is supporting countries right now to develop investable pipeline of projects, involving also the private sector, because private sector in Africa has been very, very aloof because they haven't understood why they should be involved. But now with the carbon markets, everyone is jumping onto it. But we also tell them that if you don't invest in adaptation, your value chain is going to be affected, and therefore you'll have nothing to process. So you'll close down. So many of them are starting. And again, a number of countries in Africa have now accredited private sector institutions as part of GCF, and therefore they can mobilize direct funding. In Kenya, you have the Kenya Commercial Bank, DSABA in South Africa, and many others. So I think what we need to do is we can shorten the period in which we are able to transition from what the advisory opinion is giving us by also taking some steps to do that. And I think there's a lot of awareness generally in the government up to the head of state level, because the heads of state attend the COPs, but I don't know why they attend, because they go and speak 3 minutes and then they disappear. But when you listen to what they have said on the podium and what I'm saying in the room as a negotiator, they don't tally. Because them, they're talking politics. Me, I'm talking about protecting the interests, the instructions that they have. And by the way, they have changed from Baku. Many African heads of state went to Baku, but never went to the podium. They said they would rather use that for bilaterals. And President Kagame spent most of the time talking to other heads of state and opportunities with other partners. And I think many of heads of state are saying, yeah, it's a good platform, but let's use it to catalyze change and investment into our country. So yes, it will take a bit of time, but we need this awareness. We need to unpack it. It's still too complicated, by the way. My brother, it's still too complicated. So we need to unpack it so that everyone can relate to it, and then it becomes part of the daily decision. Okay. I'm sure if you talk to CCD today, none of them will speak to this advisor opinion with a lot of respect.
They will be here tomorrow on a panel.
Thank you.
Yes. So we are coming to the close of the panel because, like I said, we are short on time. So please prepare your questions. We'll take at least 3 questions. In the meantime, quick fire. But with quick fire, I'll try to give each one of you a different question. But to start with the overall question where all of you get to answer. Here you answer with one word only. One word for what the ICJ ruling means for my country. Starting with you, for your country. What is your country and what does it mean for you?
In the United States, it means ignoring. For Greece, it means progress.
Okay. One word? Your country and the word.
And for Africa, opportunity.
Okay. But your country is?
African as well. So that's why it goes for my country, it goes for Africa. Okay. It just goes for everybody. So okay. Opportunity.
Opportunity, George?
Yeah. It took the word from me, but robustness. I think for me, that's what it provides.
Okay, Dr. Lee?
I'm from China, so I guess the one word for my country is action. That means take more actions.
Action. Okay. George, finish this sentence. Since you're the negotiator on this panel, finish this sentence. The biggest lie told in climate negotiation is?
Tough one. The biggest lie is that you can separate adaptation from mitigation. The two are inseparable. And even if you look at, and many people don't look at it, go and look at the Paris Agreement, Article 4, paragraph 7. It says mitigation co-benefits arising from adaptation actions shall contribute to NDCs. And yet we have adaptation in Article 7 and mitigation in Article 4 and 5 of the Paris Agreement.
Okay. Ambassador, your question. So fast forward to 2030. We're in 2030. The African Court has issued its advisory. We know it's considering something right now. COP32 has happened, and are we better off than we were today? And what has made the difference?
We're only better that we are having new advisory opinions that are supporting the negotiators. We are moving, I would say, we have zero movement. We spend so much in negotiations, in going to COPs, causing so much damage to climate change, even to go to COPs. I've contributed to 3 or 4 journals. And what's the outcome? We need to spend more for the action than the talk. The Loss and Damage Fund was announced in Sharm el-Sheikh, activated in Dubai. And what's the outcome? They pledged 300 million, while at the same, on the same day, the Western Hemisphere or the global North give billions to Israel to commit genocide in Gaza. Come on. This is the reality we're living in, and this is the problem we have to face.
Okay. Dr. Lee, what happened in the ICJ proceedings that never made it to headlines? Is there something that happened during the ICJ proceedings that did not make it to the headlines? Make it into the news?
My personal idea. I want to highlight a couple of things in the Vice opinion, which today I didn't hear much discussion. Well, I hear discussion, but I hear people discuss there is not sufficient science law interaction. But I want to clarify that to the contrary, I think ICJ in this Vice opinion embraced the science to the maximum level. The name IPCC alone is mentioned more than 100 times in the Vice opinion. And I'm not sure if you noticed or not, 1 month before the hearing, there was a meeting between the ICJ judges, all of them with IPCC experts. And it's an important meeting. It was recorded in the press release and also recorded in the Vice opinion procedure history itself. So science does play a very important role. And also more than 2 or 3 IPCC reports have been cited in the Vice opinion, not only the summary of the policymakers, because many scientists or treaty negotiators here, you are very very aware that only the summary of the policymakers, it's adopted by the 195 member states sentence by sentence. But the rest of the reports, they may be a little bit wild and go beyond that. So in my opinion, ICJ really embraced the science and IPCC reports. Okay. And I also want to highlight one thing, that I think ICJ opened the door for more weight of the COP decision, because not only did the court cite multiple COP decisions, the court also emphasized the COP decisions may be found reflecting customary international law, as long as it reflects the state practice on penal use. I think that's a highlight. That's basically telling people Paris Agreement is an evolving instrument, and it's open for future negotiation and more development and more agreement to be reached in the future negotiation. So that's a highlight. Also pave way for more successful treaty negotiations in the future COP conferences. So I think those needs to be highlighted. That's not really put in the spotlight of the ICJ Vice opinion.
Okay. Okay. Christina, you get the last one. If the advisory opinion were a proverb, the ICJ advisory opinion were a proverb, what proverb would it be?
I know many proverbs. I'm going to answer the question of Jenny, actually, to end on a positive note and say that something that didn't end up in the headlines, but those who were in the room, not just for the arguments, but for the reading of the opinion. There's coverage of the small island states and the coalition that they built, but there was a broader coalition beyond that, including the small island states, including African Union, including all interested in aligned states, and the friendships that were built, and just the overall feeling of rejoicing and seeing each other in the corridor, and being so excited to be there to argue the case and to see what the court would come down with, and then for the reading and point by point saying, yes, okay, they got that right, they got that right, and then just this feeling of euphoria. And I'm not sure that made it into the headlines, or at least not at the same level, but maybe somebody else has a proverb they'd like to offer.
Okay, as you think about it, anyone with questions?
Yeah, just a quick one. I'm Daniel Olago, University of Nairobi. There's this issue of solar radiation management, which is now picking up a lot of speed. It's not really mentioned in the advisory opinion. What are your thoughts on it? And by the way, to Joyce, this one is easily attributable. But what are your thoughts on solar radiation management?
Okay, who would like to take that?
Dan, you are the scientist who should be answering that question. You can't throw it to us. Yeah, I think the challenge we have is that a lot of research on solar radiation has been largely not and already supported some of our scientists to do that, but has not been fully accepted within our deep understanding. I did attend one of the meetings that was convened at Cape Town, University of Cape Town, and we had the minister from Ghana who the intention was to try to understand where the science is and where the policy people are and how they understand the process. And from that meeting, it was very clear that even the scientists themselves from Africa, you haven't identified the different options that would be appropriate to move them to the policymakers so that you can see how. So I know there's a lot of pressure right now. When we're having the Africa Group of Negotiators strategy meeting in Ghana, we also had another meeting parallel on SRM, and I was being dragged from the AGN to go there, but I refused because I think the scientists, you're not yet clear in your mind what you want the policymakers to act on. And I mean, Dan, you know, policy, you've been involved in policy work. A policymaker wants clear options, very clear options, and so that you assess the risks associated with that policy. Are they able to absorb those risks, or they are ready to take those risks? Because remember, those are votes. If the policy doesn't work, they may lose votes. And if it works, very fine. They now praise themselves as having made the right decision. So as scientists, I think that's an area that the decision of the AMCEN is that moratorium. Okay? There's a moratorium until there's a governance framework. So Dan, go and develop a framework, bring it to AMCEN, then you'll unlock that. Otherwise, these pieces that we're getting from all over is going to be a bit of a challenge. I see he still wants to come.
No, I just want to say AMCEN is really behind. Developed countries are already moving into the realm of policy. There are many ethical questions coming up. What needs to be done? Weather modification in itself you can talk about it as being climate engineering.
You're a
And a lot
proponent.
is happening. So I don't think that AMSEN, by just saying moratorium, is doing anything. We need support for African scientists to get to the forefront of this.
Okay, you've woken up the scientists.
While we wait for the scientists, can I share? I now have my proverb. Rolling stones gather no moss.
Oh, good.
So if we get moving, we can make the progress we need.
That's good. That's a good one. Patricia, you had your hand up.
Yes, I did. And it's actually to support the senior scientists here. And so the IPCC in AR7 has 2 chapters in Working Group 2 and Working Group 3 that addresses solar radiation management. And if we have a moratorium against even research, then it means we get disadvantaged in the science. So the science does not adequately reflect realities here. And the chapters are actually, the outline outlines what will be discussed. So it looks at ethics as well and risk management. So my opinion is that the science needs to advance. And if the science says it's not feasible for this part of the world, or if we are also talking about technology transfer and how that becomes difficult for developing countries, then the science has spoken. But in the absence of the science, it's really difficult to refuse entirely that discourse on solar radiation management. Thank you.
Okay. Yes, Dr. Satish.
Yeah, thank you, Zainab. I think it's a one-liner for my elder brother, George. How can AGN can be a little bit effective in what it does? So to ask diplomatically, how can AGN be more effective to fight for Africa's rights?
Be careful, because the COP is coming to Addis, and you're based in Addis. So, yeah, no. I think. Let's be honest. Let's look at the climate architecture. Africa are how many countries? 54 UN plus the Western Sahara, 55, but 54 UN, okay? All the 54 are parties to the convention individually. The European Union, 27 members they sign, but the EU is a party. And therefore, as a package, EU takes the quota they feel EU needs to do, and then it goes back home and divides and say, okay, before UK ran away, UK, this is what your level of contribution, this is what you can do, Germany and the rest, so that the CBDR is actually also reflected in the EU, okay? So you will not find in the room, when we're negotiating, the EU representative, and that is usually the technical person or the country which is the presidency at that time, after speaking, Germany taking the floor as Germany. No. Now, AGN, we started it in 1995 primarily because of the numbers. Many delegations were one because UNFCCC used to support only one delegate. And so if you have 10 negotiation work streams, are you able to follow as one individual representing the country? In Kenya, we only used to have Masawa, Emily, those who know Emily. In Tanzania, it used to be only Richard Muyungi, and like that. Now, it became necessary so that you say, okay, who can follow technology, who can follow adaptation and the rest. But remember, they are what? Individual countries. Now, it became difficult because sometimes you could go in the room, you speak, and then another country from Africa takes the floor and actually talks the exact opposite of what you said. Then we moved to ministers. And it meant that we needed now to inform the ministers, because the ministers are the ones who negotiate during week 2. The heads of delegation are the ones who negotiate during week 2. And if the ministers do not know what the technical people are negotiating, then it means that they will not be able to negotiate. And that's why AMCEN becomes an important tool. In 2009, in Copenhagen, we had a nasty experience because President Obama, you remember when he was a president, he wanted that outcome. And he worked with Africa and said, we need one spokesperson for Africa. And it became, you know who it was, Prime Minister Meles. When we were in Copenhagen, before the Prime Minister Meles went to the podium, he came to speak to the ministers, the AMCEN. And he said, you know, I'm going to speak on behalf of Africa, and I'm going to propose 100 billion, which we have agreed with President Obama. The first objection came from the chair of AMCEN then, who was South Africa. She said, but you never discussed with us. That's not what the position of the ministers. And then another one, Algeria, we were chair of the AGN, objected, and it became chaotic. And Prime Minister Meles walked out. He said, I don't care what you think, but I'm going to speak. And he went to the podium and we were watching him now speaking. But as he did that, he triggered one thing. Talking direct to his colleagues. Within 1 hour, all those ministers who were rebellious, they were supporting him. When the heads of state arrived now, we had a meeting, and the first person to take the floor was President Zuma, who now assumed the chair of the AMCEN. And he said, Prime Minister, we're going to support you. Tell us what you want us to do. And it's on that basis that a decision was made that the Committee of Heads of State, which Meles was heading, must be aligned with the chair of AMCEN, so that you don't get a minister rebelling against a head of state. Are we together? So you ought to realize where Africa is coming from. These are independent countries, but you are bringing them in a coalition that is not binding. And so even up to date, I must tell you that there are times you take the floor, you finish, and another country from Africa takes the floor and says, we want to associate ourselves with the statement made by the chair of the AGN, and then they say theirs, and theirs contradicts what the position of Africa is. Because that's, they have to assert their position. So yes, we're trying, but at least we have attained many common approaches. And we hope that the Addis is going to be one, because we are now looking at what would we want to achieve in Addis, and we hope that we'll achieve there. We do have a problem because, as you know right now, CAHOS is chaired by Kenya, AMCEN is chaired by Libya. So we are back in 2009. So we may have some tension, but we're hoping that that will be sorted out.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we really do have to close this. We really do have to close this because it's getting really late. Thank you very much for making time, and even for sitting until this time. Wow, you guys are strong. For sitting still until this time. You've done, clap for yourselves. Clap for yourselves. Great. So thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for making time for this panel. I'd like to hand back to Philip Osano for next steps.
Yes. If you can scan that code, we do have the advisory on a DST, decision support, AI-driven decision support tool. So you can actually type there whatever question you want. If, for example, if you ask, what are the principles underpinning the ICJ advisory opinion, it will give you a summary of it. You can have it as PDF, you can print it and the rest. Test it. We are testing it with the UNEP now. And if you find it, if there's anything you want to comment, please, there is a colleague there, Leon, share those ideas and we're improving it. And anyone who wants to work with, because now we have very many bosses here, those who are actually in the room, please work with them. So Leon, follow up so that, and also my sister, in your personal capacity, not as ICJ, please look at it and make any comments and have further conversation with that. Sorry, over to you, Philip.
No need to apologize because I guess that's exactly we are here for this kind of thing. So thank you so much, George. Let's give a round of applause to the panel. And also to Zainab for a great moderation. I just want to say that it's been a profoundly exciting day. I think I would like to thank all of you for being able to stay the course and particularly for experts that have really contributed. I was today like feeling like I was sitting in a class because there's a lot of things to learn. But unfortunately, we can never have more than 24 hours. So we have to make sure we utilize the time we have in a good way. So I'd like to invite all of you for a cocktail reception. So you can unwind, you can get to relax, you can get to network as we look forward to another great session tomorrow. So thank you so much. We'll just get out there where we'll have the reception and my colleagues will be there to direct you as appropriate. Otherwise, unless there's any logistics, Imelda, any logistics announcement?
Good evening.